Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I know there's some folks still coming in. Thanks for coming in. Thank you for coming and joining on our last session of today. My name is Lindsay Marshall. I'm one of the product marketing managers at SAS, and it's my great delight to introduce Adolfo from JP Morgan Chase, and he is going to give us his presentation around a private cloud deployment of SAS Viya. So let's give it up for Adolfo.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everybody's enjoying the conference so far. So I wanted to start by giving an overview of the partnership that we have with SAS that started back in 2020. Okay, for those of you that don't know, JP Morgan Chase is one of the leading financial institutions in the world. It traces its roots back almost. It started on the wrong section. Sorry. It traces back 225 years. It banks 82 million U.S. customers and provides services to 90% of the Fortune 500 companies. Its payment networks process $10 trillion a day. Okay, so that's about, if you do the math, comes out to about $8 billion a second that transacts through our payment networks. And we have a massive investment in modernization and technology of $17 billion annually in technology investments. In 2020, correct. Just a little bit of overview of myself, just so you have an understanding of where I come from. I joined JP Morgan Chase in 2020, okay? And my remit was to spearhead the firm's SaaS modernization initiative, okay? And a little bit of background. I have over 25 years of experience of working with SaaS, including both as a developer and administration, okay? Prior to joining JP Morgan Chase, I helped support clients and companies in various industries, including communications, energy, manufacturing, life sciences, and of course, financial services, okay? I did that as part of, directly prior to JP Morgan Chase as a part of Deloitte. Okay, and then various other companies that I worked for beforehand. In 2020, JP Morgan Chase was in the midst of a modernization initiative. Their goal was to basically incorporate robust controls into every one of their legacy systems, focus on security, okay? Their security posture was stringent. It was a security-first initiative. They wanted strong foundational elements, innovation, to enhance agility, scalability, and security, all on modern infrastructure. And they approached everything from a least required privilege model, and meaning that if you do not require the privilege, you cannot justify it, you were not going to get it. No more, no more unlimited administrative access or root privileges unless you could provide a justifiable use case, which in most cases would be denied. And a focus on automation and continuous improvement and continuous delivery. That led to modernizing our SaaS infrastructure and our SaaS deployments to incorporate into JPMC's modernization agenda. In order to do so, we had to integrate SaaS with the firm's identity services, implement enhanced cybersecurity controls, for both services needed to include identity and authorization and automated resiliency. We focused, again, on the least required privilege, which, if anybody's familiar with SaaS, and I'm sure all of you are, is like, SaaS required root privilege in order to be deployed, okay, at the time. All communication from the infrastructure was started at deny all, okay? Deny all communication within the infrastructure. We did not allow communication unless it was explicitly defined and provisioned. And deployments had to be automated. Everything, whatever was built and customized had to be done automatic. At one point, it had to reach complete automation or as much automation as was feasible. And we also had to focus on resiliency. Okay, resiliency was key to maintain business operations throughout the entire life cycle. Okay, so at the time in 2020, we had a very large SaaS 9 platform. Okay, it was built on IBM Power Systems. It had about 15 different SAS 9.4 deployments. I believe that there may have been a couple of other stragglers across the firm, but they were servicing about 3,000 users with 12 petabytes of data and across every line of business. Okay, and at that time, we believe we had 75 production servers and somewhere around 120 to 130 additional servers that's total, supporting both development and testing. Okay, and they encompassed various server configurations, single server, multi-server configurations, mostly to service the user's needs. So the initiative, the SAS modernization of version 9 focused on, okay, we had options as to how we approached our modernization. Okay, we could continue with SAS 9 if it was feasible, but in order to do so, in order to be able to incorporate SAS 9 with the rigid requirements that JPMC required, it would have required us customizing SAS 9, especially any identity management interaction with the firm systems. Access provisioning would have to be handled through the firm systems and not within SAS. It had to be run on modern infrastructure, which means we could no longer run on AIX servers. So the option was to move them to either commodity hardware or something that could be supported within our modern data centers. And all this was achievable at the time, but it would have required massive customization on our part or on SAS's part. At that point in time, SAS was working on the next generation of software, so SAS 9 customizations were not necessarily a priority at the time. So we looked at possible options to modernize our software. One of them was, of course, looking at SAS Viya, which at the time we looked at 3.5. This was early 2020. We looked at, oops, sorry. What did I lose here? Okay. We looked at SAS Viya 3.5 as a possible option to modernize, as a possible option for our SAS platform. Okay. At first glance, it seamlessly integrated with our systems. Okay. There were no issues with identity provisioning, authorization. All was supported and could be integrated with our third-party systems within the firm. It introduced new features and functionalities that our users were happy to have or were eager to consume. But unfortunately, it failed to comply with the contemporary security standards that the firm had. Specifically, sorry, that gets a little loud. Specifically, it required elevated privilege for deployment. Okay, it required that you have root privilege in order to be able to deploy it across multiple servers, which we did not allow. That the implementation within the organization had been restricted for all applications, not just SAS. So we would not be able to deploy it. So at that point, we approached SAS and asked them if we could work together to find a solution to our problem. Senior management from the firm sat down with senior management at SAS and developed the structure for a partnership. Okay, a collaborative partnership that would be able to address the issues that we needed. They had a product that they were getting ready to release, which was Viya 4, okay, that would be able to address every issue or need that the firm had, okay. It was designed to be for cloud. It was designed to go into the public cloud with no issue, and it was built and managed by Kubernetes and built to run on Kubernetes. It was capable of scaling on demand, and it had seamless integration with our company systems. There was we could easily manage this implementation from within the firm's systems without an issue. However, there were a variety of challenges that we had. But before, I'm sorry, Viya 4 was an excellent candidate for deploying into our private cloud that we were in the process of standing up at that time. Okay, and for those of you that don't know, a public cloud and a private cloud are basically essentially the same thing. Okay, the only difference is a private cloud is you own the infrastructure. You own the infrastructure in-house, and you have a capital investment that you make in order to maintain server, and your costs are fixed. Okay, public cloud are managed by a third party, such as AWS and Azure, and allow you the ability to scale on demand with unlimited resources because they're willing to provision as many resources as you need. Okay? However, for our private cloud, we needed to encompass and adhere to the firm's security controls, okay, and security perspective. Okay, VIA 4 at the time did not necessarily adhere to our requirements on our private cloud. The JPMC private cloud was designed to run multiple applications within a cluster, which means clusters were multi-tenant. You would have neighboring applications that needed to be functioned alongside other applications, and you could not have adversely affect any of the applications in that environment. There were also applications could not be deployed with cluster-wide privileges. Okay, you had to the only privilege that you could obtain, and the only administrator privilege that you could obtain was at the namespace level. Okay, which means if you needed to function anything outside the namespace, you would not be able to do so. Okay, there was no cluster-wide privileges. There was no you could not label your nodes. Okay, you could not do any tainting. No daemon sets, no elevated privileges whatsoever, and which meant we could not leverage the tools that SaaS provided for deployment, such as the workload orchestrator. That was something that we could not do. Luckily, SaaS provides a variety of options when facing these types of challenges. One of those was to be able to customize our deployment process by doing it manually. Okay, the manual deployments was the approach that we could face or we could leverage in order to successfully implement into our organization. However, the issue that was encountered at this time was the privilege. We had to find a way to deploy the application without adversely impacting other applications and without actually gaining any type of cluster-wide admin privilege or administrative privilege. That meant that we had to identify every aspect of the application and its deployment process that required a cluster-level privilege and justify to our cybersecurity organization, why it needed to be done. And if it was a true requirement and there was a true justification and it was properly reviewed, then only then would it get approved and be managed by our central Kubernetes team or cloud team. Okay? They would make the decision as to whether or not that privilege could be executed. Okay? Not necessarily the application team that was working to implement the solution. Okay? So we took every piece of YAML code that, for those of you that are familiar with VIA, their SaaS basis of the foundational software that is used, so the foundational files or languages, YAML files, that are used to actually deploy the application and streamlined every line of code or expected every line of YAML code to determine what privilege was actually necessary at the cluster level and what was actually could be handled at the namespace level. If it could be adapted and utilized from within the namespace, then we allowed that privilege to remain within the namespace, and any cluster-wide level privilege was then identified and segregated and reviewed by a third-party team within the organization. That team decided, okay, this privilege is appropriate for your use case and can be provided for you in a limited instance or a limited case. Okay, that led us to the, that led us to partnering with SaaS to identify every aspect that could provide, we determined the necessary privileges that would remain, that would not negatively affect the adjacent applications, so that SaaS could modify their software and improve it, so that the software could be easily deployed with a least required privilege model, and made the adjustments to their software that allowed us to actually function within a restricted environment. As part of that partnership, we at JPMC agreed to create processes and procedures for assessing the exceptions that would be required by SAS and reviewing them with our cybersecurity controls and controls team to formulate methods for allocating those essential privileges in a manner that was in accordance with firm regulations and procedures. Okay, we developed optimization strategies for our manual deployments and identified any different or appropriate privilege that needed to be applied at the cluster level and built automation around it. Our deployment process was broken down into a set of modifications that we colloquially refer to as cluster-wide privilege and namespace privileges. Okay, we tailored the site modifications that are used as part of the deployment process to meet the private cloud expectations, which meant we asked SAS to include support for a custom ingress controller, because at the time they only supported one ingress controller, which was Nginx. And at the time, the Nginx controller was not supported on our private cloud, and is still not supported on our private cloud due to cybersecurity controls. Okay, and since we also approached the deployment and the operation of the software from a deny-all perspective, we required that communication policies or network policies be declared. Okay, the application could not, by default, anything that ran within our environment was not allowed to communicate with any other service outside of the namespace. Okay, inside the namespace, you were fine to communicate, but if you had to communicate with anything outside the namespace, that had to be explicitly defined. Okay, we included, as I mentioned earlier, support for the additional ingress controller, because we ran with something with an alternative to Nginx, which is using Project Contour, okay, which was another open source ingress controller. As part of the process, we identified all the cluster administrator level privileges that were required, which in this case were the role bindings, role-based access controls, service accounts, and we built a process where we could explicitly define those required privileges and have them managed by a centralized team outside of our application team. Okay, our process indicated that whenever we created a namespace within the environment, we would trigger a pipeline that was supported by our centralized team that had the cluster level privileges that would go through and apply the required privileges at cluster creation. Okay, once those privileges are required and the required privileges were delegated to a service account that existed within the namespace and only within the namespace, we could successfully deploy the application by leveraging that Kubernetes functionality. That allowed us to then take the role of the namespace administrator, okay, and be able to deploy the remaining parts of the application. Okay, the remaining parts of the application, including several parts of the namespace administrator, included your persistent volume claims, your deployments, your stateful sets, the cron jobs, the HTTP proxies, let's see, the SAS service accounts that are required to run the application, any roles and role bindings that are required for the services to run, the config maps, secrets, and various services, as well as any pod disruption budgets that we established as part of a high availability configuration. We required that everything be run resiliently, which means that instead of deploying just one instance of the services, we needed to deploy both. So we established policies and procedures to do so, as well as defined pod templates in order to be able to run user processes. Okay. In this model, allowed us to achieve a successful deployment after collaborating with SAS for 6 months. It was, and when I say literally, I don't mean the modern definition of literally, where they actually mean figuratively. Literally sat with SAS on a daily basis, working collaboratively to identify every change that needed to be made, okay, to the deployment process in order to successfully operate this application and deploy it within the environment. Okay, we reviewed over 1 million lines of YAML code to identify privileges and properties that were actually truly required and ones that could be removed or optimized. We tackled dozens of challenges or blockers and successfully overcame them. And after 6 months, in August of 2022, okay, after 6 months of collaboration, we successfully deployed SaaS Viya 4 into our private cloud, and we were up and running in development. This was a big success. After 2 years of work and collaboration, we successfully had an environment that we could stand up and run and start processing code. Okay, so we started looking at our processes and developing, and looked at what was next. Next thing we were going to do, or the next obstacle that we needed to do, is we needed to take this into production. But our security perspective and standpoint at the time required that the privileges that you have in development are for development only. When you get to production, the privileges are even stricter. There are stringent controls in production that will prevent you to perform functionality that you could perform in development that you would not be able to do in production. That is when we faced our next challenge. SaaS, for those of you that know anything about SaaS and how it operates, it sits on top of a SaaS infrastructure data server that currently is only supported using PostgreSQL. Okay. Previously in SaaS 9, it was PostgreSQL, Oracle, and SQL Server, if I remember correctly, were all supported. But in Viya, it only supports PostgreSQL. And inside is a third-party PostgreSQL database that is managed by a third-party vendor that will remain nameless. Okay, but if you know SaaS, you know who it is. Okay, their database functions properly and is very well integrated with SaaS. However, that Postgres data server required a privilege in order to operate efficiently, requires a privilege that we do not allow. Okay, that privilege is restricted at both the test environment and production environment. So when we hit test, everything came to a grinding halt. It was like, for the most part, it was like, the required operation that needs to be performed by this database is not allowed. Okay, we went back to SaaS and worked with them to try to find a solution to this challenge. And it was a challenge. Since this was managed by a third party, we went to the third party as well and entered into discussions about eliminating this required privilege so that we could operate within SaaS Viya as it was designed. However, the vendor for that Postgres that creates and manages that Postgres database was reluctant to alter their software. Okay, they pushed back and said, there is no need for us to modify our software or the way it functions because there are plenty of other customers that function properly and can successfully deploy this application without any issue. Okay, if it works for them, it should work for you. Well, that didn't fly very well or didn't go over very well with our organization's management. Okay, we recognize that we were not going to allow that privilege to exist within our infrastructure. Okay, so we started looking for solutions. Okay, most likely for every challenge that we face, there is a solution. There's a workaround. As I mentioned earlier, SaaS supports a third externalization of the infrastructure data server. Okay, that infrastructure data server does not need to operate inside the application. It does not need to be the one that is packaged with the software. So we identified an alternative that was built, an alternative Postgres database, an operator that was external to SaaS Viya, that it was built for Kubernetes. It was built to run for Kubernetes. It was based on open source software and did not require the privilege. Okay, the privilege that was required was removed from this application. This application was, this version of PostgreSQL was able to run successfully without any issues, okay, and was able to function properly and integrate with SaaS without any additional work on our side or on SaaS's work. We simply leverage the functionality and scalability that SaaS provided, which is what brought us to August 2022. In August 2022, we had our first successful deployment in production, and we started running in SaaS Viya 4 on, SaaS Viya 4 production workloads that were running August of 2022, okay? From there, we started migrating our users off of SaaS 9. Okay, those 3,000 users, we started to examine their use case and identify those who had a use case to maintain SaaS Viya and continue to use SaaS Viya, and we moved them to the SaaS Viya platform. That migration over the next 2 years, okay, grew for us to deploy 34 production deployments on a private cloud, which we currently manage. Okay. Now, those 34 deployments also encompass 850 custom compute contexts. Okay. Those custom compute contexts are managed within our environment through a centralized source of record, okay, that allows us to automatically update and modify any compute context or configuration when everything works as expected within a matter of minutes. Okay. And on any good day across the time, if you look at our current operating model, we have over 9,000 Kubernetes pods, all servicing SaaS Viya. Okay, whether it be SaaS services or SaaS user processes, those 9,000 Kubernetes pods are actively working to service our users, which number at this point about 2,700 users within our production environments. And again, across every line of business. These deployments are business critical and help the firm achieve its business objectives, ensuring that every aspect, whether it be regulatory reporting or business functions, are addressed by the platform. Okay, we've been able to implement scaling strategies to gradually migrate dynamic resources and allocation workloads across the platform. And we took a lot of learnings from this. Okay, a couple of the key learning aspects from this is the importance of identifying the restrictions of your platform and continuously monitoring and collaborating with the vendor, in this case SaaS, to be able to effectively run the application. One of the later or most recent learnings that we've taken away is everything that SaaS builds around their software has a specific purpose and function. Okay, their orchestration tools, okay, that are used to deploy their software provide essential benefits that may not be that were not available to us because we did not use the orchestration tools. We had to build custom processes around our deployments in order to address those features and benefits that the orchestration tools, such as managing the pod scheduling effectively. Okay, one of the things that we learned was the load labeling, tainting, those daemon sets that SaaS provides as part of their software would have been useful had we been able to utilize them, because they would have been able to allow us to efficiently manage our pod scheduling. Okay, the startup of services, deployment and following maintenance. Okay, there's several policies and procedures that are implemented, services that are implemented by SaaS Viya and their orchestration that would have been of great benefit for us as we started our application. However, since we weren't able to leverage this, we had to build those we had to customize those and build them ourselves. And we are still in the process of addressing some of those. Okay, we needed to create custom deployments to account for and ensure efficient operation. Okay, of our systems. And to this day, we continue to work collaboratively and effectively with SaaS to ensure that we can maintain our operations. As we move forward into the future, okay, we have a small footprint on AWS. AWS is our public cloud provider of choice, okay, and we currently have a deployment that is 1/10 the size in AWS. Okay, AWS cross one of our SaaS via risk engine deployments, which is services about 300 users. Okay, but again, it is centrally managed by our cloud team and has enhanced cybersecurity controls because it operates as a virtual private cloud where we have the same level of restrictions, well, the same level of security controls, not necessarily application controls on that environment. And we will integrate with SaaS AWS's managed services to leverage their functionality and third-party services to be able to operate our SaaS via platform effectively. Now, one of the biggest things I'd like to recognize is that this effort and this 5-year journey was a true collaborative effort between us and JP Morgan Chase. I mean, between JP Morgan Chase and SAS. Okay, SAS was effectively partnered with us to ensure that we would be successful and that we would be able to continue to operate in a manner that was in alignment with our security posture and our firm's controls. Okay, it was key that we ensured that all policies and controls from the firm were honored, and without the effective partnership that we had with SAS, this collaborative effort would have failed. There were several blockers and instances on our side that prevented us from initially focusing and being able to work with SAS. Luckily, those obstacles were removed and those challenges were addressed, and we were able to successfully reach the current level of operation that we of SAS via 4 that we're at. And if I'm not mistaken, we are one of the largest, if not the largest, SAS via implementations outside of SAS. Okay, and of course, before I conclude today, I would like to call out a couple of people who without whom this effort would not have been successful. Okay, there were 2 individuals at JP Morgan Chase with whom I worked collaboratively as well that were instrumental. Manish Jha and Sharon Mudgal, I hope I got that name pronunciation, were key aspects in helping us work to solve this problem, and without whom none of this could have been done. And of course, on the SAS side, okay, the 2 people that were incomparably, or without whom none of this would have been done, is Craig Rubendahl and Eric Bourne. They're the ones that sat with us on a daily basis, and to this time, one of them still does, okay, on a daily basis to address any issues that may arise and be able to solve the problems and challenges that we face, okay? So with that in mind, if anybody has any questions about the process that we underwent, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks for your presentation. I have a question. You mentioned a couple of times that you weren't able to use Taint on your node.
Taints, yes.
Yeah. I was wondering, how do you manage the workload placement?
Pod affinity and anti-affinity rules. We had to develop our own set of pod affinity and anti-affinity rules in order to distribute the workload placement across all the nodes. Okay, so we built our own set of rules to do so. So.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I think I can speak loud. So
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, I have the questions regarding the customization that you introduced.
Yes.
You know, when we adopt a vendor product, introducing customization is absolutely not recommended. And when you do the customization, it creates technical debt on the future roadmap of the product and releases and applying the patches. How you plan to mitigate that?
That is correct. We approached this with a the mindset of being able to continuously improve and continuously deliver on our customizations. So luckily I worked with a team of individuals that share that mindset and goal, and everything is managed and through source code control, okay? Every customization is not done in a silo, okay? It's done collaboratively. Everything is properly documented, well, documented as thoroughly as possible in order to ensure that any aspect of the customization could be identified and improved on and enhanced. And it is a continuing journey. It's a never-ending journey, okay? Modernization does not stop at point A or point B. It has to be something that you do every day and continue to do so in the future. Okay, every aspect of that customization will change. Okay, that is a significant investment of time and money that you need to be able to be prepared to make at the very beginning. Okay, it's not going to stop. SaaS software is going to continue to evolve. Infrastructure is going to continue to evolve as well. You need to be able to adapt. Okay, your modernizations, your customizations will have to be able to adapt as well. Okay, it's not just fix it now and forget about it. You have to be able to envision the future and the possibilities of what is to come.
Hi, congrats for your presentation. That was great.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier that you have critical processes, critical use cases. Did you implement anything regarding HCDR?
Not that I am aware of. It may have, but not that I have firsthand knowledge of. Okay.
Okay.
But
thank you.
Most likely it may be executed, but not that I have firsthand knowledge of. Okay. And just to give you a perspective, my team is mostly responsible for the technology aspect of the application and ensuring that the platform is efficiently run. Okay, and is operational. We have a whole set of users and application owners, well, a smaller set of application owners and processes where they are responsible for owning and doing the process. We support them, ensuring that their processes run efficiently and effectively within our infrastructure, but most of those business processes are managed by other teams within the organization. My team, which we refer to as the SaaS Center of Excellence within the firm, is tasked with maintaining the operational integrity of the platform.
Okay, but you don't have any DR, for example,
yes,
for the platform?
Yes, we do. We are completely, I'm sorry, I think I misunderstood your question. I thought you said HLMR.
No, high availability and disaster recovery.
High availability. Yes, sorry, I misunderstood.
How do you augment the resilience of your environment, basically?
I apologize, I misunderstood your question.
No problem.
Yes, high availability and disaster recovery, we do have in place, okay? We've automated the process so that half of our deployments are operational and serving active requests at any given time. We are in the process of automating the process that basically ensures parity between our production and disaster recovery systems. So in the event that the data that is servicing active requests is synchronized with the passive environment that is in standby, ready to service. So we have synchronization and backups handling not only the system file systems, the SaaS system file systems, as well as database to be replicated into DR. Okay, and all the business data is automatically synchronized and replicated across both systems. Okay, so yes, we are one resilient organization that we try to prepare for every eventuality. Okay, the goal is, should anything ever happen, that we get back up and running as soon as possible. And our processes are required to be documented and ensure that should something happen, should the people that actually actively manage the platform get hit by a bus or get washed out in a flood, somebody can come in and stand up that application and get it up and running as quickly as possible. Okay. What happens if you get hit by the bus scenario? Okay. It can happen. Anything can happen. We learned that in 2020. Okay. A large portion of the population was wiped out by a pandemic that had not occurred in over 100 years. So anything can happen. So you have to prepare for every eventuality.
Hi, you said it took about 5 years for this process.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how long you thought it would take? And if not, what's the difference between your estimate and the actual time? And what would you advise for an organization trying to go through a similar process? How would you communicate to your leaders how long of a process this could be, and help me understand how you would estimate that amount?
So no, 5 years was not the roadmap I had in place. And for all intents and purposes, SaaS is SaaS, okay? Whether you implement it in organization A or organization B, SaaS functions the same in either one, okay? It's the configuration for that particular, for organization A and the configuration for organization B that are gonna be unique, okay? Each one of those will be, you have to be able to tackle, assess your requirements and be able to identify what your obstacles are gonna be, okay? And you're not gonna be able to identify all of them, okay? There will be some obstacles that you will not appear until you actually get smacked in the face, excuse the analogy, by them, okay? They will bring your car to a grinding halt, okay? It's key to run requirements gatherers. You need to be able to understand if you're doing a public cloud, understand what the resources, do your due diligence, identify the services that will support your use case best. If you're doing a private cloud, the restrictions that will be imposed on that private cloud, how you can function and operate, identify those, spec them out, work with your partners, whether it be internally or externally, to identify those resources and map a proper implementation plan.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a few small questions. Hope you can give me quick answers. So, is there any cost benefit when we migrate from the traditional SaaS to this SaaS VIA?
Yes, there is you can realize a significant cost benefit, okay? So this is where you have to look at the process from a user perspective, okay? Most of your users, I have two types of users. I like to categorize SaaS users into two buckets. One is your traditional SaaS developers and SaaS programmers that understand what they're doing, and then you have your, what I colloquially refer to as your click and pray users, okay? These users are users that have processes which they just run on a regular basis that they inherited that is maybe 1 or 2 generations old, okay, and then maintain, okay? If you take those processes and just do a lift and shift into your SaaS VIA, you're not gonna see any benefit, okay? You actually may see a negative impact, okay? However, if you optimize your process, which is required, okay, you should optimize those processes and leverage the functionality and ability of SaaS VIA, and you'll be able to see the cost benefit, okay? Because you have to operate efficiently, especially in the cloud.
Got it. Thank you. And then, during the transition, is there any impact or kind of your team needs to make any changes to the data warehouse, or where the data is stored, or we don't need to touch anything there?
No, you don't need to touch anything in your third-party data sources. You only need to modernize your connections to those third-party data sources. Okay, you have to upgrade and adapt your configurations to be able to connect to those data sources. But no, you don't have to change anything on the data source side. Okay, the teams that manage those third-party databases most likely have to do absolutely no changes to those data sources for you to be able to consume. That's one of the great things that SaaS does. It does allow you to consume data for almost any data source with minimal oversight or minimal overhead, okay?
Yeah, this is great. And another small question is, have you done any like a POC, proof of concept, or pilot, kind of at the very beginning, you do the full, complete?
No, we did do a proof of concept at the very beginning because we needed to make sure that we could take the VIA software as it was and be able to implement it. And we did have users run their proof of concept, be able to run their processes on the new platform.
We have time for one more question.
So you showed in one of the slide that comparison between private and public.
Yes.
The slide showed like public would be better, but still you went for private.
There are trade-offs. There are both financial benefits and pros and cons, and as well as operational pros and cons to both. Okay, it depends on your organization's use case. In our case, our use case at the time, was justified or required that we stay on-prem and that we deploy the application on-prem. But we did have at the same time one use case, which is the small AWS footprint that we currently have, that made better sense to put that on AWS. Okay, so it depends on your use case. Okay,
Cost of ownership, you think it's higher on-prem, right?
I'm sorry.
Cost of ownership, you think?
The upfront cost of ownership would be higher on-prem because you have to have the initial capital investment that you need to make to get that infrastructure up and running. Okay, so your initial investment will be higher on-prem, but the trade-off for the public cloud is that there is no upfront cost. Your investment in the public cloud will depend on how long you lease those services from a third-party
Do you
provider.
have any plan to move to cloud?
We do. It's like, well, we're already on the cloud. It just happens to be a private cloud. To the public cloud, we like I said, we already have a small footprint. And as our use case grows and the requirements to go to the public cloud, yes, we've already started to stand up additional instances of SaaS Avaya on the public cloud. Okay, but we're in the process of doing our due diligence on those to make sure that we can run them efficiently. Because one of the biggest obstacles you'll face going to a public cloud provider is you need to be able to run efficiently. You need to be able to operate your services efficiently, or else that investment that you make is going to grow over time. Okay, and it's going to affect your return on the investment. Okay. You want the larger return on investment. You don't want to decrease your return on the investment. So it is essential that you be able to leverage not only the software but any third-party services within or managed services within the cloud provider that you select to be able to run efficiently, because you need to be able to operate efficiently. If you don't, you will essentially see the bad issue or you'll see the bad end of the bad aspect of cloud. Cloud can get very expensive if you don't run efficiently. Okay, the investment will be significant, but it's the return on that investment that you'll have to optimize.
Much, Adolfo. I really appreciate the time taken to share your modernization story so far. I love the fact that you say it's an ongoing journey, so thank you so much. Let's give it up for Adolfo.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Well done.
Thank you.